Hi, I'm Professor Chris Alden, Director of LSE Ideas, and I'm here today with Dr. Dimitrios Stroikos.
Thank you, Chris. I'm Dimitrios Stroikos, LSE Fellow at the Department of International Relations and head of the LSE Ideas Space Policy Project.
Dimitrios, I want you to share with us some of your thoughts about the challenges that space offers to the study of international relations and international politics more generally.
Since the 2000s, early 2000s, we can see a growing number of themes, but also challenges underpinning the international politics of space. This can include the militarisation, and some would argue even the weaponisation of space, the globalization of space activities, what we call the democratisation of space, that is the growing number of states that have a stake in space activities, but also the growing number of non-state actors now that are involved in space activities. Another important challenge is tackling space debris, which has implications for the long-term sustainability of space. And of late, and of course this is related to what we already have highlighted, is the return, if you like, of great power competition in space.
Sounds fascinating and so often not thought about. So the issues such as states and non-state actors come into play, something we're familiar with in international relations. Are there distinctive features between how states behave and how non-state actors behave in this area?
I think what we're seeing is the ever-increasing complexity of global space governance, not least because of the growing number of non-state commercial and private actors. One of the most important issues is the lack of a framework for some commercial and private activities. We're seeing that in the context, for example, of this also hype to a certain extent of mining for lunar resources. It is sometimes difficult to distinguish what is private, what is public, what is also state or non-state. For example, what has happening in Ukraine, we saw clearly the role of private space companies providing satellite images that played a key role in terms of having a good idea of the maneuvering of troops on the ground. Another good example here is how Musk, through Starlink, intervened to provide access to the internet to Ukrainian soldiers. But this has been controversial from other states, such as Russia and China. For example, very recently we saw Russian authorities claiming that Starlink satellites can be legitimate targets. And essentially we're entering into an uncharted territory given the lack of regulations and a framework for drawing the line about what is a military activity, what is a civilian activity, and so on. And of course, this adds to the issue of how complex global governance of space is becoming.
That's interesting. When the governance is not in full shape yet. It's still not. There's some treaties and various regulatory regimes emerging, but they are not fixed, and they're also. This is all occurring in a period of heightened great power competition. What do you think of the prospects for ensuring that we don't have an outbreak of conflict of some kind in space?
Mm-hmm. It is true that there was a lot of progress during the Cold War in the context of international space law, with 5 treaties governing activities in space, the most important of which was the Outer Space Treaty. But many would argue that this is a bit outdated now. It hasn't accounted for all these developments and advancements in technology. There have been many diplomatic initiatives over the last years to try to establish a framework, for example, for dealing with malign activities in space. You have one group of states that would like to see a legally binding treaty banning space weapons. The problem is, of course, that the Outer Space Treaty bans nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, but it allows for the use of space weapons. It is important to highlight that since the advent of the space age, space-based assets have been very important for military purposes, especially satellites for communications, navigation, reconnaissance, surveillance, and early warning system. And that was during the Cold War, of course, and those assets were very important in the context of nuclear deterrence. And the Soviet Union and the United States decided to continue using space assets for military purposes. They were very important, again, in the context of the Cold War, but decided also to show strategic restraint by not weaponizing space, that is, the use of actual weapons in space or treating space as a battlefield. But what we're seeing in recent years is the increasing interest in counter-space capabilities. One example here is the role of anti-satellite weapons. This is about launching rockets from Earth to space, destroying satellites in orbit. There are other sorts or types, if you like, of destructive and non-destructive space, counter-space capabilities, including co-orbital anti-satellites, cyber attacks, electronic warfare, such as spoofing and jamming satellites. There is the issue of using directed energy, such as lasers. And again, there is not a framework for governing or drawing some red lines about these activities. And of course, this is compounded by the return of great power competition. It is also compounded by the inherent dual-use nature of space technology. So now we're seeing a normative shift towards non-legally binding and voluntary measures, focusing on defining what is a responsible behavior in space. And this is also taking place right now within the United Nations framework. Perhaps we're also seeing an arms race unfolding, the early stages of an arms race. What is very interesting is that, as I mentioned earlier, the United States and the Soviet Union decided to show strategic restraint. This led also to arms control treaties, and there was strategic dialogue. What is very concerning right now for the space community is that this sort of strategic dialogue is not taking place, for example, between the United States and China. Some steps could be building transparency and confidence building measures and establishing a venue for dialogue. We saw how the recent event with the balloon created so much anxiety. And what is also very concerning is that you might have accidental incidents that can escalate to warfare in space, and how this can also be implicated with terrestrial politics, of course. So there is the need to, for great space powers, but also for the space society of states, to find ways to establish a framework for what is permissible, what is responsible behavior, and what is not.
Why do countries want to join this new space race? Is it commercial interests? Is it prestige? Is it resources or competition with other powers on land back in Earth? How do we understand
I would
that?
say it's all of that. Well, clearly we are seeing the commercial and economic benefits that can derive from the use of space assets. Political motivations are always very important, both for your domestic audience, but also for the international audience, especially when it comes to high visible space achievements, such as human space flight or lunar and Mars exploration missions. Those are seen as a state's normative indicator of modernity, great power status, and prestige. Then there is also this notion now of rushing to claim a stake at lunar resources, for example, who is going to be there first. That is also an important motivation.
It seems that science is playing second fiddle in all of this, though contributory.
Unfortunately. Well, we have been a lot of scientific missions as well. And a good example is also the International Space Station that still exists and operates despite the geopolitical tensions on Earth. But it is true that it has been more the role of political and international imperatives than scientific imperatives. Again, without saying that scientific, the generation of scientific knowledge that derives from missions is not important. At the same time, though, we're saying the completion of the Chinese space station and how this, from a Chinese perspective, is also a contribution to international cooperation, given that the space station will be available for other countries to participate and conduct scientific experiments as a way of providing public goods. India recently also launched what is called the South Asia satellite that can be used from South Asian states. So there are also elements of leadership and cooperation in the context of China and India as space powers.
And when it comes to this increasingly crowded space domain, things you mentioned earlier, space debris, how are we going to, we humans and spacefaring nations, how are we going to address this increasingly crowded skyline that we have up there?
Yeah, that's a big challenge right now. Even if we would stop any activity right now, there's so much space debris, so there can be collisions between existing space debris, and this can create even more space debris, and this creates a sort of a cascading effect, what is known as the Kessler syndrome. That means that we might eventually lose access to space, and we go back to the industrial age in many ways. There have been efforts, there have been diplomatic initiatives. One of the issues there is that your space vacuum cleaner, for me, might be your space weapon. Again, it's inevitable not to take into consideration the inherent dual use of space technology. And with the lack of trust and the lack of transparency that usually accompanies these efforts, it's very difficult to find a solution. But again, there are diplomatic initiatives within the United Nations. There are certain states that try now to establish and create technologies that can be helpful in tackling space debris. There are also efforts at, from a legal point of view, but much more needs to be done to ensure the long-term sustainability of the space environment and the long-term sustainability of space activities.
It's interesting. It's almost a litmus test on international cooperation, a step forward. Everyone will gain from this, and yet they're finding it difficult to take that collective first step. So
yes, it's very true.
And do you think that that ultimately human space flight and involvement is going to be the driver of greater cooperation in the long term, or will it catalyze more competition?
Now there's so many challenges, but cooperation has been very important from the beginning of the space age. It's worth remembering that even the launch of the first human-made satellites that were placed in orbit were part of a major global scientific event that was the International Geophysical Year. There is scope, not least, for more cooperation, given that the costs involved in space exploration can be enormous. So from a rational choice point of view, it would make sense for states to cooperate. I mean, even during the Cold War, for example, the US President Kennedy was keen to cooperate with the Soviets in space, although this didn't work in the end. But I think we need we need to change our mental maps in this regard to highlight how international cooperation can lead to to yield results for everybody involved rather than focusing on competition. I think we will still see the coexistence of competitive and cooperative elements in space, but of course, going back to what we have been discussing, the geopolitical climate of today makes things very much complicated. So it is very important, again, for the great space powers to assume great power responsibilities by ensuring the stability of space. So we shall see.
Well, thank you very much, Dimitrios, for a wonderful presentation, and we look forward to your research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks for having me.